In the troop, four boys and their scout leader take their yearly voyage out to Falstaff Island, PEI. Meanwhile, a man with insatiable hunger heads toward that same island to distance himself from the main island. It isn't long before the two meet, and our scout leader needs to make a decision about how to help this man, how to keep the kids safe, and instill the lesson of helping those less fortunate or in need. This novel gives Lord of the Flies with more speculative fiction and far more detailed horrors. There is a long list of content warnings down in the description if you're somebody who wants those. Max couldn't keep the look of horror off his face. It was instinctive, what most would feel when faced with a member of humankind who no longer looked like he belonged to the species. The stranger didn't wholly resemble a man anymore, more like something a dull-witted child might have drawn with a crayon. His body was lines, his arms were scribbles, his fingers were calligraphic spiders. The skin draped his ribcage with terrible intimacy, pinching around each rib to show the striation of muscle. The writing style is visceral, but I do have some pet peeves. I have this weird aversion to what I think are bad similes. So, this is weird and very personal, and so I don't put too much weight on it when it comes to recommending the novel. It's just something that I can't not mention, and we'll talk about some specifics in the spoilers section. Overall, the descriptions are wildly graphic, but in the best way possible. If you're squeamish, this is not a book for you. I found the pacing to be quite quick. This is a longer novel than I usually read. Not that I'm against long novels by any means, but it didn't really take me that much longer to get through as far as days, partially because I couldn't put it down, and partially just because it was drawing me through those pages. That being said, I didn't feel like we weren't given time to breathe. There were definitely still quiet moments of tension, but these quiet moments were not calm. So it felt like the pacing kept being fast, even though there were times where we were just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Structurally, while I think adding articles and files and the like to beginnings and endings of chapters can be a very effective choice, it didn't land for me in this particular novel. Many, in my opinion, revealed just a little bit too much and or didn't really add anything to the present. I would classify the troop as heavily plot driven, but there is definitely some fun and interesting character development and exploration. The focus is truly on surviving the island, but the choices made are very clearly made by teenage boys. So it would be a very different story if it were a different group of characters. The plot point pacing is well executed, as I was saying in the writing style portion. The introduction of this extreme hunger, without getting too specific, really compresses the timeline in an interesting way and like amps up the stakes of the situation. Obviously, survival situations are relatable. Even if you haven't really been in one, you can kind of understand how being low on food and water and being out in the elements might feel. But the stakes are way higher simply because there's this added danger. I do think the premise is interesting, but I also think that there could have been different and better choices made in exploring it. There's kind of both too much and too little focus on the source of the hunger. I actually would have preferred knowing less about the source and focusing more on the island, almost to the point where I think there could have been two different novels here. One could have been this survival island story, and the other could have been a more sci-fi, more heavy speculative fiction novel, like exploring the actual origins. All the revealing of the sources felt kind of out of place and easily could have been summed up in the intro and the outro of the novel, perhaps as a prologue and epilogue, but I think even so, it could have been integrated. I think the introduction did a really good job of integrating it. And even the end, the resolution, kind of integrated it. I don't know that we needed all of the pieces in between just because they felt out of place. They didn't really explain anything that felt important to the plot. Really, it just felt like they paused the story to info dump, which I think they did a lot of really cool world building. I just think it could have been executed in a more cohesive manner. As for the aforementioned character development, I do really like the variety and interplay of the classic kind of like boyish stereotypes. And I think we get some really interesting reflection from the boys on their coming of age time and being put in this traumatic situation. And kind of, you'll have to wait for spoilers for that one. But the kind of reflection on maturity and coming of age and the difference between boys and men from the boys' perspective is really interesting. And you can definitely feel the effect that the genre has on these aspects, both character and kind of that reflection of coming of age, because certain stereotypes and aspects are put into the extreme that just wouldn't be necessary or feel right in a non-horror genre. I think this novel is good if you really enjoy shock value and put a little less emphasis on the structure of the stories you enjoy. And I am not here to judge what parts of novels need to be a certain way for you to enjoy them. In fact, I really struggle to choose a rating for this book because I found it so enjoyable despite its kind of like structural and writing things that kind of like rubbed me the wrong way. So I'm putting it at a solid 3 for that entertainment while it kind of annoyed me with its structure and writing style and that very specific thing that I try really hard to ignore, which is what I think are bad similes. Looking over some of the other reviews, I think there are a couple things to note when deciding if this book is for you. The first being just the absolute detail of gore and violence and a couple of the other themes. And then the other one is a lot of people were really put off by the fact that it was kids in this situation, which I think is odd. Um, I think I think people are maybe a little bit too precious with kids sometimes, but I also totally understand the aversion to wanting to see kids in more adult situations like a survival setting, especially left alone. But we have the classic Lord of the Flies. Um, so it's not, I don't know, it's maybe a product of time that people are upset about it. So I just think it's something to note if you are sensitive to, violence and danger and stuff like that of children. Probably not the book for you. And like I said, kind of at the top, if you're squeamish, this is not going to be for you. And if you're only squeamish about particular things, I highly encourage looking up the content warnings or sticking around to the very beginning of the spoilers section where I will kind of tell you what I've been beating around the bush about because it's not revealed on the back cover. I didn't want to reveal the source. um, when it all comes down to it, if you enjoy Lord of the Flies, visceral, gory descriptions, and hard hitting survival questions to be answered, then The Troop is a book for you. Hell, his voice had even picked up a hint of the native twang. Yet he'd forever be viewed as a come from away. People were unfailingly friendly and respectful of his skills, but his veins swam with mainlander blood. He bore the taint of Toronto, the big smoke, the snobby haves to PEI's hardscrabble have-nots. Around here, it's as much a case of who you're from as where you're from. Bloodlines ran thick, and the island held close its own. Okay, spoilers. If you're here just for this, the source is a worm. So we're talking like parasite, we're talking descriptions of a lot of worms, we're talking about descriptions of one large worm. If that grosses you out, not the book for you. And then there's also a couple other things that I'll note right up at the top of this that are spoilers, but I think are worth noting before we get into like the actual spoilers. That these are spoiling for sure, but there is graphic description of the abuse and death of an animal. Two animals actually, maybe more, definitely two though. There's pretty graphic self-harm, um, and there's some weird sexual stuff that's brought up that I saw a lot of people were kind of put off by in reviews. It didn't bother me at the time, but it takes a lot to bother me. So yeah, I think those are the main content warnings that I think would be important for people to know going in. There is, um, obviously harm and big spoiler, there is death, both of adults and of children. Um, and then lots of things around that hunger, including like fat shaming, and I would say that there's like you might also find things with like eating disorders triggered by it. Um, I think that's that. So we'll get into my actual spoiler notes now, which I'm gonna pick the book up for because I definitely have some like pages and stuff that I'll pull up to kind of remind myself what I was thinking. So the first note that I have, these are not really in order because I took them from a couple different places. I didn't have them like super compiled, so I'm gonna find the big at the end of chapter 7. Yeah, so there's an article that I say at the end of chapter 7 that feels like it gives too much away. And specifically I say that it's an interesting piece, just not sure it's in the right spot because it gives so much away. Yeah, so it's kind of going over um the original Very Hungry Man. um, and kind of like how he came to be who he is, and comparing him to Typhoid Mary, Patient Zero. Um, yeah, so I guess my main issue with that section is that we know that that man dies. And kind of looking back on it, it maybe doesn't matter too much. But I did find that this was um, a pattern throughout where I would read an article and be like, ooh, I feel like that gave a little bit too much away. Like there's another one. Actually, the next note that I have is that we find out that there's a lone survivor while most of the people on the island are still alive. And and I don't know if like I don't think that that again like I feel like this was just like a bad um example of the issue, because this one is kind of like it's good, it's bad, because knowing that there's a lone survivor, it gives the reader the opportunity to try to guess which character makes it to the end and how and why and what that means for the story. But at the same time, then you also know that there's going to be a lot of death coming up, which again is maybe like a good thing because it's like, oh, good, now we know that we're really only rooting for one boy. Um, so looking back again, this one I feel like is kind of a bad example of it. I think more of my issues with um the introduction of the files and interviews and articles and things like that was kind of the more info dumping ones. Like there's one that um just goes into the different types of worms, and I just didn't feel like it added anything to the story to understand how there are different types of worms. So like there's the idea that there's like the queen worm or something like that, and then like a bunch of like little worms, and they kind of have like different purposes. And while that's really interesting, um, I just don't think that it added to this, which is what like I think that part would have been really interesting if we had like a more sci-fi based book that is talking about that like follows the life of the scientist. Because I think that would be like a really interesting book all on its own, and I think it being kind of like ham-fisted into this one just didn't land for me personally. Um, Going back to the lone survivor, this is one of those things that I always like wish that I was read like doing a buddy read about it, because then I would love to have that conversation during the book about who we think is going to be that lone survivor. Because I had an argument for almost any character, which I think is kind of interesting. Um, and me as a reader and a writer, I always want it to be the interesting choice rather than the obvious choice. And I do think that they did the obvious choice. I think sometimes the strangest choice is maybe like a little too betraying of the reader. Like, I think it would have been a really interesting story had Shelley been the one who was left alive because he was kind of the most unlikable character. But I also think that that would make a lot of logical sense. Um, I do think it makes sense the way that it went, but I think that being that psychopathic, manipulative um, character could have also saved him for very similar reasons that it was his downfall, because he was trying so hard to manipulate everybody else into like getting sick. Um, but also he could have been so selfish to like save himself if he wasn't drawn to manipulate everybody the same way. So I think that could have gone either way, and I think that that's kind of like an interesting thing to consider. For Kent, he was the first boy to get sick, so I don't think it would have ever made sense for him to be the one to survive. But it also kind of would have been interesting if he survived, I don't know, because like he ate everybody else or something like that, you know? Like he survived, but he was obviously infected and going to die. That would be an interesting story. Um, Newt making it out because he's smart would have been interesting, but he's also very caring and wants to take care of everybody else, so it makes sense that he would get infected. Um, Ephraim is an interesting one. And I'm gonna slot this note in here. The point where he is like hearing Shelley tell him that there's stuff inside of him. I'm still unsure if he was infected at that point. I don't know if he was truly infected, but while he was like carving into himself, I had this thought that he thought his veins were worms and he was gonna like rip a vein out of his arm. And that, like, I was like waiting for that description to come through because it seemed like the perfect kind of gory description for this book. It never happened, but like that was like something that I created for myself to like gross myself out, I guess. But the argument for like him to make it is because like he was like the person who thought he would make it. He was very like headstrong, despite the fact that like Kent was the like stereotypical alpha dog, I guess. Ephraim was kind of his like mirror in be like they most of them were very headstrong and either wanted to be leader or would make a good leader. Because then we come to Max, who it just makes sense that he is going to be the one to survive, and that's what I mean by the obvious choice was made. Ouch. I know, buddy. I don't know what you want right now. You literally just ate. Um, Yeah, like it just makes sense. Like Max was kind of made into the golden the like low profile golden boy by the scout leader and by the boys in like a weird way because the like good leader is generally the one who doesn't want to take the lead. And Max was kind of like happy to not be the leader despite the fact that the adult kind of like put him in charge. He didn't feel the need to fight for that, which I think makes him like the virtuous character, which then of course leads him to be the one who should come out in the end. Um, should. So I wasn't surprised by it, but I was hoping that like something weird would happen, and a weird like choice would be made. Yeah, so I kind of have two more things. One is to talk about the similes. I did try to find some examples of what I mean, and I think I have a really good example of the bad because it kind of has a good in it as well. Let me find it and explain. So it says rain needled down so hard that they felt as though their faces and arms would be sliced open, like walking through a storm of paper cuts. Do we see why? And like maybe other people don't. And in one of my like notes, I was musing about whether I would have even noticed this before I kind of like worked on that like editing eye, if that makes sense. Because honestly, like we have a simile and then we tack on like a second simile, and I actually think the first one is good. I don't have a thing against similes. I have a thing against similes that feel out of place, or that like take things too far. So like I think rain needle down so hard that they felt as though their faces and arms would be sliced open. The felt as though is technically a simile. And I think that's already a great description that is like like the rain's never actually going to slice you open. Therefore, this is not like a literal description. And we don't need to compare that slicing open to a storm of paper cuts. Like I understand, and I'm sure lots of people actually love that line. I just feel like it's taking it a step too far. It doesn't need to be there. It doesn't actually add anything. It just made me giggle, which is not what I think should be evoked by that sentence. I think stopping at feeling as though the rain will slice you open, that's great. That's visceral. Calling it paper cuts almost makes it less serious. Like, as much as I understand paper cuts hurt like a bitch, I just I just don't think like the storm of paper cuts needed to be there. I do have another one marked, and like in hindsight, I don't think this one is amazing, but I think it allows me to explain kind of like my thoughts about it again. Um, so it says he was gnawing on the moldy tarp, working the frayed edge like an old man gumming a carrot. I don't think that this is the best one, but I think it's exemplary of something that I'm looking for when I look at a simile, which is like not going too far away from the source. Um, and what I mean by that, like, is like he's chewing and then he's compared to something else chewing. It doesn't always have to be quite that specific and quite that close, but that's why it didn't bother me so much. I don't think it's great, but it did really put an image in my mind. And so I think it did what it was supposed to do, whereas tacking on the whole paper cuts thing ruined the moment for me. Whereas like picturing a kid kind of like freaking out and gnawing on a tarp. I would have been happy to just see him gnawing on the tarp. I don't really need the simile, but picturing a toothless old man chewing on a carrot kind of does bring like a particular feeling to the moment. It doesn't, well, maybe makes me giggle, but like in a different kind of way. I wish I had some better examples, but I wasn't thinking about taking those examples. And I find it really hard to find them when I go back. I did try. Can you stop, please? I love you so much, but you're really killing me. Um, um, the other thing was on page 335. This is the final note I have written here. Um, which is I think it's Max talking about the difference between adults and kids. Yeah, it talks about like the like things that adults are scared of are different than the things that kids are scared of, because kids are scared of like monsters under the bed while adults are scared of like their poor financial situation kind of thing. Um and then he says there's no 12-step or self-help group for dealing with those fears, talking about the ones that kids fear. And then he says, or maybe there is, you just grow up. And he talks about how the minds are different, and how uh, kids like can believe so much more, and their minds are like more plastic, irrational. But I think the most important sentiment is, but for now he still believed enough, and maybe that had kept him sane. Because he's reflecting on the fact that the like sense of the hunger, the worms, the danger of that, sent some of the kids into a tizzy like immediately, like they were like freaking out about it in a rational sense, I suppose. And then I guess kind of how like Max still has hope, I think is kind of what it's getting at. And that's kind of the idea of like why some of the kids could handle this situation more. Um, and also uh, why some of the kids had like a better chance of making it out, I guess. Oh, it's more that the kids can believe that it's happening, whereas it's hard for the adults to believe that the like really weird thing is happening. So like Max is like the worms exist, and like um here are all the ways that I think I can kind of like deal with that, whereas the adults kind of go, that can't be happening, and then like their brain breaks. Either way, it's interesting to consider that kids versus adults, one of them is better suited for different types of situations. Like in some cases, kids are better suited for survival, whereas in other cases, adults are better suited for survival, at least from like a mental standpoint. Um, and I mean, part of that is being able to imagine things, because that also allows you to imagine things are less bad than they are, or different than they are. Whereas adults like see the true reality of it, I suppose. And so they break faster in a situation like that. Whereas like a kid can imagine that like just around the corner like there's like a bunch of blueberries or something, or even something more fantastical than that. Or they can pretend that they're in a completely different place. And that's why traumas get repressed so much easier as kids. I think that's a thing, because they like more easily like paste a different memory over it, or just like and like all of our memories are fickle in that way. And talked about that a bunch of times for tips in editing. But I mean it's truthful for many things. Like we don't, nothing that we remember is remembered truly how it happened. It's always glazed over with perspective and reflection and experiences before and since and things like that. Uh, because our brains put emphasis on different things. So even if people experience the exact same thing, no, they didn't. They didn't experience the same thing, and they certainly won't remember it the same way. I think that's it. So, as a reminder, if you enjoy Lord of the Flies, visceral, gory descriptions, and hard-hitting survival questions, no, hard-hitting survival decisions, The Troop is a book for you. Oof. All right, are you gonna let me read my quotes? Iggy, leave my moose alone. I don't remember what that whole sentence started as. Do you ever do that? You start a sentence and then you forget what the first part of the sentence was? That's why I have a script, but I go off script so often, which usually makes for a better video. These are more notes than script. Anyways, you coming over, Iggy? I put something new up to block it because it's somehow even brighter now that it snowed.